My name is Eli Marsh, and I'm recording this from the back office of a hardware store on the edge of a town that no longer behaves like a town. If you are listening, please do not assume any of this is metaphor. The streetlights flickered twice at 11:57 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. And by morning, the sidewalks of Hollow Bend were as empty as the inside of a closed mouth. I want to start there, with the flicker, because that is the seam where my old life and whatever this is were stitched apart. And I've spent every hour since trying to remember which side of the seam I belong on. I was awake when it happened. I had been awake for most of that week, actually, because my sister Caro had moved back into the house 2 months earlier with her 7-year-old, Theo, and the guest room shared a wall with mine. Theo had night terrors. Caro had insomnia. I had a job at the lumber yard that started at 5 in the morning, and I had stopped pretending any of us were sleeping. That night, I was at the kitchen window with a glass of tap water, watching the streetlight on the corner of Linden and Vance because it had been buzzing for a week, and the city had not sent anyone to fix it. At 11:57, by the clock on the microwave, it went out. Not gradually, not with the orange wind down of a dying bulb. It simply stopped, the way a held breath stops. Then, half a second later, every other streetlight on our block did the same thing in perfect unison, as if some long invisible hand had walked down the row, pinching wicks. They came back on a beat later, off again, then on, steady, like nothing had occurred. 2 flickers. That was all. I thought it was the grid. I thought it was a substation. I went back to bed because I had to be up in 4 hours, and because the body, even a tired one, prefers ordinary explanations. At 5, my alarm did not go off. The power was fine. The phone was fine. The alarm had simply not been set, which was impossible because I set it every night with the same reflex I used to lock the front door. I went to the kitchen to start coffee, and that is when I noticed the silence, not absence of sound. Sound was there. The refrigerator hummed, the pipes ticked. A dog somewhere a few houses over made a single low complaint, and then thought better of it. But under all of that, the morning was missing something I had never thought to name until it was gone. There were no cars on the through road, no truck engines from the depot, no school buses idling at the corner where the Calloway twins waited at 6:15. I went to the window. The street was empty, not empty the way a street is empty at dawn, with the suggestion of motion just over the horizon. Empty the way a stage is empty before the actors arrive. Every door I could see was closed. Every curtain was drawn. The Calloway's porch light, which had been on the night before, was off. And their station wagon was still in the driveway, which it never was on a Wednesday. I said Caro's name once, quietly, into the hallway. She did not answer. I said it again, louder, and Theo's small voice came back instead, asking if it was time for school. I told him to stay in his room. I do not know why I said that. I had no information. I had no instinct that should have produced that sentence. But I said it. And I heard Caro shift in her bed and ask what I had said. And I told her to keep Theo upstairs until I came back. I put on my boots. I opened the front door. The first thing I saw on our lawn was a shoe. It was a child's shoe, a white sneaker with a Velcro strap. And it was sitting upright on the grass about 6 feet from my porch step, perfectly placed, as if someone had set it down to remember where they had been standing. There was no other shoe. There was no child. The dew on the lawn around it had not been disturbed except for one narrow track, 4 footprints long, that led from the sidewalk to where the shoe sat and then stopped. as if whoever had walked there had been lifted straight up into the cold air. I stood on the porch for a full minute without moving. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, and I remember thinking that I had never noticed before how much a heartbeat sounds like someone knocking on a door from the inside. Then I walked down the steps, picked up the shoe, and looked at the name written in faded marker on the inside of the tongue. It said Mira C. The Callaways had a daughter named Mira. She was 8. She rode a purple scooter down our street on Saturday mornings, and she always waved. I put the shoe in my jacket pocket and walked to the Callaways' house. The front door was closed but not latched. I knocked. No one answered. I knocked again, harder, and the door drifted open under the second knock, the way an unlatched door will. Inside, the hallway light was on. A coffee mug sat on the entryway table, still warm enough that I could feel the heat when I touched the ceramic. A single set of car keys lay beside it. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no overturned chairs, no blood. Just a house that had been left mid-sentence. I called out for Dan Calloway. He had coached my middle school baseball team a lifetime ago and had become, in the way of small towns, the neighbor who borrowed my ladder twice a year. He did not answer. I did not go upstairs. Something in the quality of the air on the staircase told me not to. The way you can sometimes feel an animal in a room before you see it. I left the door the way I had found it and walked back across the lawn to my own house, and that was when I saw the man at the end of the street. He was standing in the middle of the intersection of Linden and Vance, directly under the streetlight that had flickered first. He was facing away from me. He wore a brown jacket I did not recognize. His arms hung straight down at his sides, and his head was tilted slightly toward his left shoulder, as if he were listening to something only the pavement could tell him. He did not move. I watched him for what must have been 30 seconds. He did not shift his weight, did not turn his head, did not adjust the way a person adjusts, even when they are trying to stay still. I called out. I asked if he was all right. My voice carried in the empty street the way a voice carries across a frozen lake, and the moment it reached him, his head snapped upright. Not turned, snapped, the way a dog's head moves when it hears a high frequency. He did not look around. He did not pivot. He simply began to walk toward me at a pace that was not running and not strolling, but something in between. The gait of a person who has remembered an appointment they are already late for. I went back inside and locked the door. I am not proud of how fast I moved. I told Caro to get Theo dressed and to come downstairs without turning on any more lights than necessary. She started to ask why, and then she saw my face, and she stopped asking. She is 2 years younger than I am, but she has always been the one who could read a room before the room knew what it was saying. She went upstairs without another word. The man reached our front walk-in under a minute. I watched him through the peephole. Up close, his face was wrong in a way I could not immediately name, and I have spent a long time since then trying to name it. His skin had the color of a photograph left too long in a sunny window. His mouth hung open by perhaps half an inch, not slack, not gasping, just unsealed, as if the muscles that ordinarily kept it shut had been quietly informed they were no longer needed. His eyes were open, and they were tracking, but they were not tracking me. They were tracking something just above my head, and I had the distinct and unwelcome sense that whatever he was looking at was real and was standing on my roof. He stopped at the porch step. He did not climb it. He stood there with his head tilted at that same angle, listening, and after maybe 10 seconds, he turned without urgency and walked back the way he had come. I watched him until he reached the intersection, where he stopped again, exactly where I had first seen him, and resumed his original posture, facing away, arms down, as if a tape had been rewound. Caro came down the stairs holding Theo's hand. Theo was in his school clothes, because that is what Caro had told him to put on, which was the correct answer to a question neither of them yet understood. I told her, quietly, what I had seen. I told her about the shoe. I showed her the shoe. She held it for a long moment without speaking, and then she put it down on the kitchen counter the way you put down something you have decided not to think about yet. We tried the phone first. The landline had a dial tone, but no one answered at the police station, at the fire station, at the school, at the hospital in Brennan, 12 miles away. Caro's cell had bars, but no calls connected. The news app on my phone loaded a front page from the night before and would not refresh. The local radio station played the same 40-second weather report on a loop in the voice of the overnight DJ, who sounded as if he had recorded it from inside a closet. Theo asked if the world was broken. He asked it in the matter-of-fact way that children ask whether dinner is ready. I told him the world was not broken, that something had happened with the power, and that we were going to figure it out. Caro looked at me over his head, and her eyes said, "Do not promise him things you cannot keep." I nodded. I would try not to. We made a list, because making a list is what you do when the alternative is admitting you do not know what to do. Water, food, flashlights, the little radio in the garage that ran on batteries, the shotgun my father had left when he died, which had not been fired in 11 years and which I was not certain still worked. Caro's car keys, my car keys, Theo's inhaler, because he had been wheezing in his sleep for a week, a change of clothes for each of us, the cash in the coffee can above the fridge, which came to $430 and which now felt both enormous and completely worthless. While Caro packed, I went to the garage and found the radio. The batteries were dead. I replaced them. The local station was still on its loop. I scanned the dial. Every commercial station was either off-air or replaying old content. On the AM band, near the top of the dial, I found a single live voice. A woman, calm, repeating coordinates, and a phrase I did not understand. Containment perimeter unestablished. Do not approach standing figures. Do not respond to vocalizations after dusk. Shelter and remain silent. She said it 3 times, then a pause, then again. I turned off the radio. I went back inside. I told Caro we needed to leave by noon. We did not leave by noon. We left at 2:17 in the afternoon, and the delay was my fault, because I went next door to the Hester's house to check on Marion Hester, who was 81 and lived alone with a yellow cat named Buttons, and I could not bring myself to drive past her front door without knocking. Caro told me to be quick. I told her I would be. I lied to my sister for the first time in my adult life on the front step of an empty house at noon on a Wednesday, and I would do it again. Marion's door was locked. I had a spare key because I had been the one who shoveled her walk for the last 6 winters. I let myself in. The house smelled like cinnamon and old paper. Buttons came around the corner of the hallway and yowled at me with the offended authority of a cat who has not been fed. I followed him to the kitchen. Marianne's breakfast was on the table. A half-eaten piece of toast, a cup of tea gone cold, a paperback splayed open beside the saucer. Her reading glasses sat folded on the book. Her slippers were under the chair. I did not call out. I had learned in the hour since the man under the streetlight that calling out was a way of telling the silence where you were. I walked through the downstairs rooms. She was not in any of them. I went to the foot of the stairs and listened. Nothing. I climbed the stairs slowly, with the shotgun in my hands, although I do not remember deciding to bring it. Her bedroom was empty. The bed was made. The bathroom was empty. The closet door was open, and her winter coat was missing from the hook, which was the first thing I had seen all morning that suggested a person making a choice. I fed the cat. I poured the last of his dry food into his bowl and refilled his water. I did not take him with me because I did not know where we were going. And I told myself that Marion would come back and would want to find him there. I have thought about that cat many times since. I hope I was right. I am not sure I was. When I came back down the porch, the street had changed. There were now 3 of them. The man in the brown jacket was still under the streetlight at Linden and Vance. A second figure, a woman in a pale blue bathrobe, stood in the middle of the Callaways' lawn, facing the house, perfectly still. A third, smaller, was on the sidewalk in front of the elementary school 2 blocks down, just at the edge of what I could see. None of them were moving. All 3 were tilted at that same listening angle, heads cocked to the left, as if the same distant sound were calling all of them. I walked back to my house without running, because running, I had decided without evidence, was the kind of motion that would be noticed. Caro had the car packed. Theo was in the back seat with his coloring book and his inhaler and a juice box. And Caro had given him headphones and the old iPod from the kitchen drawer, because she had understood, faster than I had, that what he could not hear could not hurt him yet. I told her about the 3. I told her about the broadcast. I told her that the highway south toward Brennan was the only route I trusted because the road north went through the woods, and I did not want to be in the woods. She agreed. We agreed on everything that morning in a way we had not agreed on anything in years. And I remember being grateful for the clarity of fear, the way it strips the small disagreements out of a household and leaves only the load-bearing walls. We backed out of the driveway at 217. The standing figures did not turn their heads. The highway south runs along a low ridge above the river, and from the on-ramp you can see most of Hollow Bend laid out below. The grid of streets, the church steeple, the water tower, with the high school mascot painted on the side. Caro was driving. I had the shotgun across my knees and the radio tuned to the woman with the coordinates. Theo was asleep in his booster seat within 4 minutes of the engine starting, which was the kind of small mercy I did not know I was praying for until it arrived. From the ridge, I counted them. I counted as far as I could before the road bent and the view was lost. I stopped counting at 41. There were 41 standing figures in the visible portion of our town, distributed across lawns and intersections and parking lots. None of them moving, all of them tilted. And from above they made a pattern I could almost see, the way you can almost see a constellation in scattered lights. They were arranged in something close to a grid, but not exactly. They were spaced as if they had been planted. Caro did not look. She kept her eyes on the road. I did not tell her what I was counting. I told her instead that the highway looked clear ahead, which was true. The on-ramp fed onto a stretch of 2-lane that ran for 6 miles before the first interchange, and there were no other cars on it, which meant either that we were the first to leave or that everyone else who had tried had not made it to the on-ramp. And I did not know which of those was worse. At mile 4, we passed a car in the ditch. A red sedan, nose down, the driver's door hanging open, the airbag deployed and deflated. Caro slowed without my asking. We both looked. There was no one inside. There was no blood on the seat. There was a child's car seat in the back, empty, with the straps unbuckled and the buckle still resting in the cradle, as if someone had paused to undo it carefully before getting out. Caro made a small sound, just once in her throat. She did not stop the car. At mile 5, The radio woman changed her message. She had been on the same loop for hours. Now she said, "Bridges south of grid reference 44 are compromised. Do not attempt crossing. Reroute east via State Road 9. Repeat. Reroute east." Then the loop resumed. State Road 9 was the road into the woods. I told Caro. She gripped the wheel a little tighter. We had a decision to make in roughly 90 seconds, because the interchange was coming up. And the choice was to trust the broadcast and turn east into the trees, or to keep going south toward a bridge that might or might not be standing. I have replayed that 90 seconds many times. There was no good answer. There was only the answer we picked, which was east, because the woman's voice had been calm and specific. And calm and specific was the only currency the morning had given us that felt like it might still be worth something. We took the eastbound ramp. State Road 9 narrowed almost immediately, 2 lanes becoming 1.5, the shoulders falling away into ditches choked with goldenrod. The trees closed over the road within half a mile, and the light inside the car turned the green of an aquarium. Theo woke up. He asked where we were. Caro told him we were taking a different way to Aunt Joan's, which was a lie, because Aunt Joan lived in Phoenix. But it was the right lie, and Theo accepted it. 5 miles into the woods, we came around a bend and Caro hit the brakes. There was a school bus across the road. It was parked sideways, blocking both lanes, its hazard lights blinking in slow orange pulses, and the driver's seat was empty. The bus was empty too. The door was open. The interior lights were on. We sat in the car for a long time without speaking. The engine idled. The hazard lights of the bus blinked their slow, patient rhythm. Theo, in the back, asked why the bus was sideways, and Caro told him the driver was probably fixing something. And could he please put his headphones back on for a few minutes? He did. He was a good child. He understood, in the way children sometimes do, that the adults around him needed him to be invisible for a while. I got out of the car. Caro did not protest, although her hands tightened on the wheel. I held the shotgun low against my leg, because I did not want to walk toward a school bus pointing a gun at it in case there was a child inside who had been told to hide. I approached the open door from the side, not the front. I looked in. The bus was empty in the way the houses had been empty. Backpacks on the seats, a juice box on its side in the aisle, leaking a small pink puddle, a jacket draped over a seat back. No people, no blood, no struggle. The keys were still in the ignition. The radio was on, very low, playing the same loop from the local station. The overnight DJ's weather report cycling under itself like a prayer. I walked the length of the bus and back. I checked under the seats because I had read enough to know that if there were children hiding, they would be under the seats, and I would rather find them and be wrong about the danger than leave them and be right about it. There was no one. I stepped down off the bus and turned to wave Caro forward. And that was when I saw the boy. He was standing about 20 yards into the trees, off the right shoulder of the road, between 2 birches. He was perhaps 10 years old. He was wearing a blue backpack. His head was tilted to the left. He was not moving. He was watching the bus, or watching me, or watching whatever it was the standing figures watched, and I could not tell which. I did not raise the shotgun. I had a clear sense, somehow, that raising it would change the terms of whatever this was, and that the terms, as they currently stood, were the only thing keeping us alive. I walked backward toward the car. I did not turn my back on him. I got into the passenger seat. I closed the door slowly. I told Caro, very quietly, to back up. She backed up. The boy did not move. The bus blinked. The radio loop continued. Caro reversed for almost a quarter-mile before she found a place wide enough to turn around. And then she turned the car around, and we drove back the way we had come. We did not speak for several miles. There was nothing to say that would not have been a lie or a panic. And Caro and I, by some unspoken agreement formed in childhood and refined in the years since our father died, did not lie to each other and did not panic in front of Theo. We drove. The radio woman repeated her message. We ignored her because her message had sent us into the trees, and the trees were not safe, and we did not yet know what was. I unfolded the paper map from the glove compartment. I had bought it as a joke 2 years ago at a gas station. And Caro had laughed at me, and I had said, "You never know," and she had said, "You absolutely know." And we had not opened it since. I opened it now. There was a service road, unmarked except as a dashed line, that ran north along the back of the ridge and connected to an old logging spur that came out near the county line. It was longer. It was slower. It avoided the bridges and the woods and the highway. I showed Caro. She nodded. We took the next left. The service road was gravel for the first 2 miles and then dirt, and the car was not built for dirt. But Caro had grown up driving our father's truck on roads worse than this one, and she handled the ruts with the unhurried competence of someone who had once been very good at something and had not entirely forgotten how. Theo had taken his headphones off again. He was watching the trees out the window with the alert curiosity of a child who has been told nothing is wrong and has decided, provisionally, to believe it. I kept the shotgun across my knees. I had checked it twice now, and it was loaded with the 4 shells my father had left in the box, which was all the ammunition we had. And I had no expectation of finding more. I was not a hunter. I had fired the gun perhaps 6 times in my life, all of them at cans on a fence post when I was 16. I did not know if I could fire it at a person. And I was already aware that the question of whether the standing figures were still persons was a question I would have to answer before I would have time to think about it. Around the 3rd bend, we came over a small rise and saw in the valley below a farmhouse. White clapboard, a red barn, a pickup truck in the driveway, smoke rising from the chimney. Smoke. Caro stopped the car. We looked at each other. Smoke meant a fire. A fire meant a person tending it. A person tending a fire meant someone who had not vanished. Someone who was still making decisions. Someone who might know something we did not. We approached slowly. Caro kept the engine running. I got out at the edge of the property and walked up the long gravel drive with the shotgun held barrel down. I called out twice at a reasonable volume. A woman came out onto the porch with a rifle of her own, and she did not point it at me, but she did not put it down either. She was perhaps 60, gray hair pulled back, a flannel shirt over a thermal. She looked at me for a long second and then said, "You alone?" I said, "My sister and her son are in the car." She said, "Bring them up. Park behind the barn. Don't let the car face the road." Her name was Ruth Avery. The farm had been her husband's family's for 90 years. Her husband had died of a stroke 4 years ago. She lived alone with 3 dogs, 2 of which had been killed last night, she told us, and the 3rd of which was inside and would not stop shaking. She said this without crying. She had the flat affect of a person who had already done her crying in private and had decided not to do any more of it in front of strangers. She fed us. She had a wood stove and a freezer full of venison, and a root cellar of canned things her sister sent her every fall from a farm in Ohio. She let Theo sit at the kitchen table with a bowl of soup and a coloring book she had kept from her grandchildren's last visit. She poured coffee for Caro and me, and she sat across from us, and she told us what she knew. She knew that the standing figures had appeared at 3 in the morning. She'd been awake because her dogs were barking. She had gone to the window and seen the first one in her own driveway. A man she did not recognize, facing the barn, tilted, motionless. She had watched him for an hour. He had not moved. At 4, a second one had appeared at the edge of her property by the fence line. By dawn, there were 5. She had not gone outside. She had stayed at the window with her rifle across her lap, and she had watched them. And she had noticed something none of the radio broadcasts had mentioned. "They listen," Ruth said. She set her coffee cup down. "That's what they're doing. They're not waiting. They're listening. And what they listen for is sound that doesn't belong." She told us what she had seen at 6:14 that morning. A deer had come through the back field. A young buck, panicked, running flat out, the way deer run when they have been spooked by something downwind. It had crashed through her fence line, and it had snapped a rail. And the snap had been loud, a sharp crack that carried in the cold air. Every one of the 5 standing figures on her property had turned at the same instant, not toward the deer, toward the sound of the rail. They had begun to walk, not run. Walk. At that same unhurried pace I had seen on the man in the brown jacket. The deer was already gone, lost in the woods. The figures had converged on the place where the rail had snapped, and they had stood there for almost a minute, tilted, listening, and then, when no further sound came, they had dispersed. They had not returned to their original positions. They had drifted to new ones, spaced out, redistributed, as if recalibrating to better cover the property. "They're hunting," Ruth said. "But they don't know what they're hunting yet. They're waiting for something to make a noise it shouldn't make." I asked her how she knew the deer hadn't been what they wanted. She said because the deer had been making deer noises, and deer noises were noises that belonged. The rail snapping had been a human noise, a fence noise, a noise that meant something with hands had been there. Caro asked her if she had seen them attack anyone. Ruth said no. She had not seen them attack. She had not seen them eat or bite or do any of the things the old movies had trained us to expect. She had only seen them listen, and she had seen them walk toward sound. And she had seen once, just before we arrived, a figure standing in her driveway open its mouth and produce a low sound of its own. A hum, not a moan, a hum at a single pitch, sustained for almost 30 seconds, and then silence. "And then," she said, 2 more figures had appeared on the road, walking toward her drive as if the hum had been a call. "They're talking to each other," she said. "They're telling each other where the noises are." Theo had stopped coloring. He was watching Ruth with the unblinking attention of a child who understands he is being allowed to hear something not meant for him. Caro put her hand on his shoulder and steered him gently toward the living room, where Ruth's surviving dog was curled on a braided rug. Theo went without protest. He sat down next to the dog and began, very softly, to stroke its head. The dog did not stop shaking, but its eyes closed. Ruth watched him go. Then she looked at me and she said, "You can stay the night, but you have to understand the rules. No talking above a whisper after dark. No flashlights toward the windows. No cooking after sunset. The wood stove is fine because the smoke smells like everything else out here. But no new fires, no engines, no doors slamming. If you need to use the bathroom in the night, you walk on the rugs, not the floorboards." I nodded. "And if one of them gets close to the house," she said, "you do not, under any circumstances, fire that shotgun." I asked her what we would do instead. She said, "We stay quiet We wait. They lose interest in places they can't hear. I've watched 5 of them stand at my fence line for 2 hours and then walk away because the wind was loud and the house wasn't. I asked her how long she thought we could wait. She said, longer than the people who didn't know to be quiet. We stayed. There was no real choice, although I told myself that first night that there had been one. Caro and Theo took the guest room upstairs. I slept, or did not sleep, on the couch in the living room, with the shotgun on the floor beside me and Ruth's dog asleep against my feet. Ruth herself slept in the kitchen, in a hard-backed chair with her rifle across her knees and her eyes on the window over the sink. She had been doing this, she said, since the second night, and she would do it for as long as she needed to. In the morning, there were 9 standing figures on her property. We counted them through the upstairs windows, careful not to stand directly in the frame. They were spaced more deliberately now. 1 at the front gate, 2 at the corners of the barn, 1 at the edge of the back field, 1 on the porch of the old chicken coop, which had not held chickens in years. 4 more scattered through the middle distance, between the house and the tree line. None of them were tilted toward the house. They were tilted, all of them, slightly upward, as if the thing they were listening for might come from the sky. Ruth said it had been 6 the night before, so 3 more had arrived in the dark. None of us had heard them come. We spent that day teaching Theo the rules. Caro did most of it. She had a teacher's patience and a mother's authority, and she explained to him, in the quiet, careful voice she used for difficult conversations, that the people outside were sick, and the sickness made them hear things very well, and that if we were very quiet, they would not know we were here, the way you sometimes do not know a rabbit is in a hedge unless the rabbit moves. Theo understood. He was 7, and he was frightened, but he was the kind of 7-year-old who responded to clarity, and Caro had given him a clear rule, and he held on to it. He invented a game. He called it the floor is listening game. He walked on the rugs. He set his cup down on the wooden coaster Ruth had given him because the wood on wood was softer than ceramic on wood. He whispered everything. He turned the pages of his coloring book 1 finger at a time. By the end of that first day, he was better at it than any of us. The radio said less and less. The woman with the coordinates had stopped broadcasting at some point during the night. In her place was a man's voice, recorded, repeating only the phrase, "Remain in shelter, remain silent, do not approach standing figures." The local station's loop had cut out entirely and been replaced by static. The other AM stations were gone. The FM band held 2 religious broadcasts that did not seem to be aware that anything was wrong, which I found more disturbing than the silence. I tried Caro's phone again. No bars now. I tried the landline. Dead. Whatever had been holding the infrastructure together that first morning had finished failing while we slept. On the second night at Ruth's, the figures in the yard began to hum. It started at perhaps 3 in the morning, the one nearest the front gate. A single low note, sustained, the same one Ruth had described. After 30 seconds, the figure at the corner of the barn answered. A different pitch, slightly higher. Then a third joined. Then a fourth. They were not making a melody. They were making a pattern. A network of tones distributed across the property, each one held for 30 seconds and then released. Each one followed by a different voice taking up a different note. It went on for almost an hour. We sat in the dark and listened. Ruth did not move from her chair. Caro held Theo against her chest, with her hand cupped over his free ear. The dog, between my feet, did not make a sound. Even the dog had learned. On the morning of the fourth day, a truck came up the road. We heard it before we saw it. The engine was loud, an old diesel, and it was downshifting on the grade, which meant the driver did not know the road and was braking too hard for the curve. Ruth was at the kitchen window before the rest of us had moved. She raised her rifle. She did not point it. She held it ready. I went to the upstairs window. From there, I could see the gate. I could see the standing figures at the front of the property turn their heads in unison toward the sound of the engine. They began to walk, all 9 of them, in slow converging lines, toward the road. The truck came around the bend. It was a battered F250, primer gray, with a man at the wheel and another in the passenger seat. The driver saw the figures. He did not stop. He accelerated. He drove straight through the gate, knocking it from its hinges, and the figures, which had been converging on the sound, scattered with that same unhurried economy of motion, stepping aside as the truck barreled past them, and then closing in behind it, walking, following, drawn by the noise the way iron filings are drawn by a magnet. The truck slid to a stop in Ruth's yard. The driver leaned on the horn. 3 short blasts. Ruth said a word under her breath that I will not repeat. I understood, in the same instant she did, what had just happened. The driver had brought every standing figure on the property into a single concentrated mass around the house. And then he had announced his arrival to all of them with a noise that could not be unheard. The figures changed. I watched it happen from the upstairs window. Their posture changed. The tilt of their heads sharpened. Their walk, which had been unhurried, became something faster, not a run, but a long strided purposeful gait that closed distance with frightening efficiency. They were no longer listening. They had heard. They knew. Ruth went to the front door. She did not open it. She unlocked it. She turned to me and she said, "When I open this door, you bring them in fast. No words, no noise. If they make noise outside, you close the door on them. Do you understand me?" I understood her. She opened the door. The driver was already out of the truck, running for the porch, dragging the passenger behind him. The passenger was bleeding from the shoulder, a dark stain spreading down his jacket, and his eyes were wide and unfocused. And he was making a sound. A low, continuous moan that was not a word, but was unmistakably a human sound of pain. The driver saw Ruth in the doorway, and he opened his mouth to call out. And Ruth raised her free hand and made a single sharp gesture, a closed fist. And the driver, to his credit, understood. He did not speak. He half carried the passenger up the porch steps. They came through the door. Ruth closed it behind them. She locked it. She slid the deadbolt. She drew the chain. The passenger moaned again, louder. The sound carried. Outside, the figures on the porch had reached the front of the house. I could hear them now. Not their footsteps, their hums. They had started humming, all of them, a chorus of low notes around the perimeter of the building. And the notes were the same notes from the night before. But they were closer, and they were synchronized, and the synchronization meant something. The driver looked at Ruth. He was perhaps 40, unshaven, with a face that had been handsome once, and was now the kind of tired that does not sleep off. He whispered, "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I didn't know about the noise." Ruth said, "Your friend has to stop moaning." The driver looked down at the passenger, who was now slumped against the wall, eyes half closed, the moan continuous, breathy, involuntary. Ruth said, "He has to stop, or we are all going to die in this house tonight." The passenger's name was Wade. The driver's name was Holden. They had come from Brennan, which Holden told us, in whispers, no longer existed in any sense that mattered. The hospital had gone first on the second night, when someone had set off a fire alarm and the figures, drawn by the noise, had filled the parking lot in under 10 minutes and then begun to come through the windows. Wade had been a nurse there. He had been bitten or scratched or grabbed. Holden was not sure which, by something in the stairwell. They had run. They had been driving for 2 days, sleeping in the truck, looking for somewhere quiet. They had seen Ruth smoke. I did not say anything to Holden about the smoke. Ruth's face had already said it. Wade was on the floor of the front hall. Caro had brought down a blanket and a pillow. She had taken Theo back upstairs to the guest room, and she had closed the door, and I knew she was sitting with her hand over his ear and her other hand over her own mouth, because that was what I would have done. The moan was the problem. Wade could not stop. He was conscious enough to try, and he would press his lips together for 10 or 15 seconds. And then the pain would come up through him, and his mouth would open, and the sound would come out, low and continuous, and exactly the kind of human noise that did not belong in the woods. Outside, the hums had stopped. The figures had gone silent. They were listening. Ruth knelt beside Wade. She had a small brown bottle from her medicine cabinet. She had a spoon. She measured something carefully. She lifted his head, and she fed him the spoonful. And she stroked his throat the way you stroke a dog's throat to make it swallow. And Wade swallowed. Holden watched her. He said, "What was that?" Ruth said, "Something to help him rest." Holden said, "How much?" Ruth did not answer him. She set the bottle down on the floor beside her, and she sat back on her heels. And she looked at Wade's face until his eyes closed and his breathing slowed, and the moan, gradually, faded into a long exhalation and then into nothing. Holden understood. He sat down on the floor against the opposite wall, and he put his face in his hands, and he did not make a sound. I watched him. I watched Ruth. I watched Wade's chest rise and fall, more shallow, until I could not be sure if it was rising at all. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I have not been honest about it with myself. And the recording is the only place I have left to try. I did not stop her. I knew what she was doing when she measured the dose. I knew before she lifted his head. I had a shotgun and 4 shells and a sister and a nephew upstairs. And I had a choice. And the choice was either to stop Ruth or to let her finish. And I let her finish. Because outside the house, there were 9 of them. And inside the house, there was a sound that would bring them through the walls. And I was not going to let my nephew die, because I could not bear what was being done in the front hall. I have told myself, since, that Wade was already gone. That the bite, or the scratch, or whatever it was, had already begun to do whatever it does, and that Ruth knew this from her years of nursing her husband through his long dying, and that what she gave him was a mercy and not a murder. I do not know if that is true. I know only that I let it happen. I know that when Ruth stood up and went back to the kitchen and put the brown bottle on a high shelf, I did not look at her face, and she did not look at mine, and we did not speak of it that night, or the next, or ever. Section 12, 700 words. Outside, the figures dispersed. They did it slowly, over the course of an hour. The humming did not resume. The synchronization broke. They drifted back to their old positions and a few new ones, redistributing themselves across the property as if nothing had happened, as if a noise they had been tracking had simply ceased, and they had no further interest in the source. Holden slept on the floor of the front hall against the wall, with his head on his arm. He had not asked where we would put Wade. None of us had said the word body. Ruth covered Wade with the blanket Caro had brought down, and she folded his hands on his chest, and she sat with him for a long time. And then she got up and went back to her chair in the kitchen. I went upstairs. Caro was awake. Theo was asleep against her side, his small hand wrapped in the hem of her sweater. She looked at me. She did not ask. She had heard enough through the floorboards to know what had happened, and she had heard enough not to need the details. She whispered, "Is it done?" I whispered, "Yes." She closed her eyes. She did not cry. I have thought about that since. Caro has always been the one who cried more easily than I did, who could be undone by a sad commercial, who had wept openly at our father's funeral while I had sat dry-eyed in the front pew, ashamed of my own composure. She did not cry that night. She did not cry the next morning either. Something in her had decided that tears were a sound that did not belong, and she had filed them away, with the slamming doors and the raised voices and the laughter. And she would not, I understood, be getting them back for a long time. I sat on the floor beside the bed. I did not sleep. I watched the window. The moon was bright, and the figures in the yard cast long, thin shadows across the grass. And from above they looked, again, like a pattern, a constellation of standing things. And I tried to find the shape of it and could not. In the morning, Holden was gone. He had left a note on the kitchen table. He had written it in pencil, in careful block letters, the way a man writes when he wants to be sure he is understood. The note said, "I cannot stay in the house where she did that. I'm taking the truck. I will lead them away from you. I'm sorry for bringing them here. Thank you for trying with Wade." The truck was gone from the yard. So were 6 of the 9 figures. They had followed the sound of the engine in the early morning, when Holden had started it and driven slowly, deliberately, back down the gravel road, drawing them after him like a man pulling a long ribbon through grass. 3 figures remained. They had redistributed to cover the gaps left by the others. 1 at the gate, 1 at the barn, 1 at the tree line. The minimum coverage, I realized, that the network needed to keep watch over the property. Ruth read the note. She read it twice. She folded it in half, and then in half again, and she put it in the pocket of her flannel shirt, and she said nothing. She made coffee. She brought a cup to me, and a cup to Caro when Caro came downstairs, and a cup of warm milk to Theo. And she sat at the table with us, and ate a piece of toast without butter. And she did not mention Wade, or Holden, or the truck, or the note. After breakfast, she went out to the front hall. She knelt beside Wade. She closed the blanket over his face. She said very quietly, so quietly that I almost did not hear her, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Then she stood up, and she went back to her chair in the kitchen, and she did not say it again. We buried Wade on the 8th day, after dark, in the root cellar. Ruth said the ground outside was too risky, that digging made sound, that the figures would come. The root cellar had a dirt floor under the shelves. We moved the shelves. We dug by candlelight, the 3 of us, Ruth and Caro and I, taking turns with a single short-handled shovel, working in shifts so that none of us made too much noise at once. It took 3 nights. We laid him in the hole on the 3rd night, and we covered him over. And Ruth put a jar of her sister's pickled beets at the head of the grave, because, she said, Wade had been a nurse, and nurses ate strange things at strange hours, and a jar of something was as close to a marker as she could make. Theo did not come down to the cellar. Caro did not let him. Theo had stopped speaking above a whisper entirely by the 5th day. He had also stopped, I noticed, asking when we were going home. He had absorbed, with the terrible adaptability of children, that home was a concept that no longer applied. And he had begun to refer to Ruth's house as here, and to the world outside the walls as out there, and to the figures, when he mentioned them at all, as the quiet people. The quiet people did not leave. Their numbers fluctuated. Sometimes there were 3 on the property, sometimes 5. Once, after a thunderstorm rolled through and the noise of the rain on the metal barn roof drew them from miles around, there were 14, packed into the yard, tilted and listening. And we lay flat on the floor of the upstairs hallway for 9 hours until the storm passed and the figures dispersed. We learned things. We learned that they did not respond to natural sounds. Wind, rain, birdsong, deer, the creak of trees. We learned that they did respond to almost anything man-made. The ring of a phone, even a dead phone's residual click. The whine of a refrigerator compressor cycling on. The flush of a toilet, which we stopped using and replaced with a bucket in the cellar. The strike of a match. We learned to cook only on the wood stove and only during the day, when the chimney smoke could not be seen against the dark sky. We learned to wear socks on the floorboards and to whisper with our hands cupped near each other's ears, the way conspirators whisper in old films. We learned that they were getting better at listening. That was the worst of it. On the 12th day, I dropped a spoon. It was nothing. It fell from the kitchen counter to the linoleum, and it made a small, bright ping, the kind of sound that, in an old life, would have been beneath notice. The nearest figure was at the tree line, perhaps 60 yards from the house. It turned its head. It began to walk. It walked all the way to the back porch, and it stood there for 2 hours, tilted, listening, before it turned and walked back. In the first week, a spoon would not have moved them. By the second week, it did. Ruth thought they were learning the sound of us specifically. She thought they were building a map in whatever passed for thought inside their tilted heads, of which sounds were dangerous and which were not, and that the map was becoming finer grained every day. She thought eventually that the sound of our breathing might be enough. I did not argue with her. I had begun, on the worst nights, to believe she was right. We talked in whispers in the cellar about leaving, about finding somewhere even quieter, about the coast or the mountains, or the long, flat, empty middle of the country where there were fewer man-made sounds for them to learn from. We did not decide. Deciding required a kind of energy that the days were burning out of us, and we were each, in our own ways, running low. On the 19th day, Theo got sick. It was not the infection. I want to say that first, because for the first hour, when his forehead was hot and his eyes were glassy, and he could not keep down the small piece of bread Caro had given him, that was what we thought. And the thought was the thing I would not wish on anyone. It was not that. It was a fever, an ordinary fever, the kind that children get from being 7 years old and cold and frightened and underfed for 3 weeks. Ruth determined this, with the calm of a woman who had nursed her husband through worse, by checking his pupils and his lymph nodes and the color of the skin around his nail beds. And by the end of an hour, she was as sure as she could be that what he had was the flu, or something like it, and that what he needed was rest and water and time. The problem was the cough. He developed it on the second night of the fever. A wet, deep, productive cough. The kind that comes from low in the chest and cannot be politely contained. He could not control it. He was 7, and he was sick, and he had been holding himself silent for nearly 3 weeks. And the cough broke through everything he had learned. And it was loud, and it was constant. And it was a human sound that did not belong. The first cough brought 2 figures to the back porch within 15 minutes. The second brought 4. By the 3rd hour, there were 11 of them around the house, and they were humming, and the hum was synchronized, and the synchronization was tightening. The notes drawing closer together, the spacing between voices shrinking. And I understood, watching from the upstairs window with Caro's hand crushing mine, that whatever the hum was for was building toward something. Ruth came up the stairs. She had the small brown bottle in her hand. Caro saw it. Caro saw it before I did. She let go of my hand, and she stood up between Ruth and the bed. And her face was a face I had never seen on my sister. A face that belonged to some older version of her that had been waiting under the skin for a moment like this. And she said, in a whisper that was not a whisper, "Get out of this room." Ruth said, "Caro." Caro said, "Get out." Ruth stood in the doorway for a long moment. She looked at Theo, who was coughing again, his small body shaking with it. She looked at Caro. She looked at me. I did not move. I want to say I would have moved if it had come to it, that I would have stood with my sister. But I had let Ruth do what she had done to Wade. And Ruth had read that in me weeks ago, and she knew that my standing still was not the same as my standing with anyone. Ruth said very quietly, "There are 11 of them. They are about to come through the walls." Caro said, "Then we run." I had not expected her to say it. I had been preparing for hours to make some terrible argument about Theo and the bottle and the lesser of impossible things. And Caro had cut underneath all of it, into a possibility I had not let myself consider. Because considering it required believing we could survive outside. And I had stopped believing that on the 4th day. Caro said, "The truck Holden left the gate open. The road is downhill from here. We push the car to the bottom of the drive before we start the engine. We drive south. We drive until we find somewhere quieter. We do not stay in a house where you are allowed to decide who lives." Ruth looked at her for a long second. Then she nodded. Once, and she stepped back from the doorway. She said, "Take the dog. He has been quiet longer than any of us." We took the dog. We took Theo. We took the shotgun and the map, and a jar of pickled beets, and we went. We made it to the car. We pushed it down the drive in the dark, with Theo wrapped in 3 blankets, in the back seat, and the dog pressed against him. And we did not start the engine until we were on the gravel road below the ridge. And when the engine caught, I heard the humming behind us rise into something I do not have a word for. And then we drove, and we did not look back. Ruth stayed. I understood as we pulled away that she had always been going to stay. The house was the last loud thing she had left, and she had decided to be loud with it. We are somewhere south of the county line now. The dog sleeps. Theo's fever broke on the 2nd night. Caro does not speak much. Neither do I. We have learned to live inside a quiet that is not the same as peace. I am recording this because someone should know what the streetlights meant. I am recording this because I let a woman do a thing in a hallway, and I did not stop her. I am recording this because my nephew is still breathing. And that is the only sentence I have left that I'm sure of.